Salam. Aamer Hussein, born and raised in Karachi, Pakistan, spent 18 months at school in Ooty before moving to London for further education. He began to write in the mid-1980s. His works of fiction published in India include the volume of short stories, The Blue Direction, Insomnia, and 37 Bridges, and the novels Another Gulmohar Tree and The Cloud Messenger. His most recent collection, Hermitage, has just appeared in Pakistan. Ziya Salam is an associate editor with Frontline. A literary and social commentator, he is involved in building bridges of commonality through a study of the Vedas and the Quran. Adopting a multi-layered approach, he also writes about literary and cinematic developments regularly. His books 365 Tales of Islam and Lynch Files will be released in the coming months. Over to you, gentlemen.
Aamer, I hope you're comfortable. It's working. I guess the lady concerned over here has said a few things about Aamer Hussein Sahab. But the most important thing is he has lived in more places than many of us have traveled to. Probably born and brought up in Karachi. Then he has lived a good part of his life in Mumbai, which was Bombay then, Indore, Gwalior, now based in London. And he's also had some schooling in Ooty. So in many ways, for Aamer Hussein today, is kind of ghar wapsi. So how do you look at it, Aamer, coming back to Tamil Nadu after so many years?
Only being here for 4 hours, but I'm looking forward to it very much. It's been a long time.
Could you talk of your early days? I remember you spent a couple of years in Ooty from 1968 to 70 at your Mamu's place.
Yeah, that was a very long time ago. It was a good preparation for England because it was rainy and cold. And there was an old colonial library with lots of musty, fusty old history books and so on, which probably taught me more about Europe than I knew before. But yeah, it was a very interesting experience, different. I mean, I was a boy from a big city by the sea, a city that's probably warm all year, and then suddenly to come to this place where I was with male students most of the time, and with very little to do apart from read and go to the cinema about once a weekend. There was a place called the Assembly Rooms, which used to show old Hollywood films, and that was my form of pleasure and leisure. So.
From the dangerous place, you felt a degree of nostalgia about Indore. It was a sleepy township and there is a bookstore and a cinema hall, and now you should have go long afternoons and I think best to do is for a friend to come over and take you out riding.
Bike, on a bike.
On a bike.
Yeah. I have something called, I've forgotten what it's called, but I can't, dyspraxia. I can't ride a bike, so I spent months trying to learn and never managed. But yes, that was all I did.
But can you recall that time of Indore today?
Very
because
well.
We are losing that part of India very rapidly.
Very well. Again, I mean, being a boy from a city, I think that leisure during the summer months when it rained a lot and there was little to do apart from listen to the radio and read and listen to stories and family histories was very relaxing. How long I could have borne it, I don't know, but 2 months of it or 6 weeks of it was quite marvelous. And there was an atmosphere that came right out of a novel, you know, this kind of
you spent just
dignity.
2 months in a year over there and left an imprint on you.
2 months a year, sometimes winter as well, sometimes winter weddings in places like Gwalior, Bhopal as well. Yeah, at times in Aligarh as well, which of course is a bigger town.
And one of your friends is still in touch with you from your Indore days?
I've just lost touch with him, but I'm sure I could find him again. He was in the Indian Army and there was a time when it was difficult to keep in touch. But yeah, until the 90s we were in contact.
Okay. You talk of listening to stories when you were a kid in Indore. Is that how this seed was sown?
You know, it's complex because I guess my parents were always reading in English. Mother read a bit in Urdu as well. My father's sister had one of the most wonderful libraries. Now I realize that a lot of those books were probably sent on subscription from America. It was something like Modern Library or something. But what you got was novels by Flaubert and Théophile Gautier and Zola, translations from French, translations from German. I was surrounded by all that international stuff. I also was fascinated by religious books, and I think, myth and legend. So, for example, when I went to Indore, there was this bookshop called Rupayan, and my uncle, who taught us in Uti as well, Sardar Muhammad Khan, would take me and buy me translations of the Mahabharata, of the Ramayana, for example, or of Kalidas. And at the same time, I read the Quran in translation largely, plus heard a lot of stories.
When you talk of Ramayana, Mahabharata, and the Quran, it actually goes against the popular notion in some circles of Pakistan, in some literary circles in Delhi, that you're an agnostic guy. And here you're talking of your early days reading books of religion.
Well, they weren't religion as much as myth and legend to me, and storytelling. But yeah, they do give you a sense of something beyond your limited life of every day.
Okay, does it also say something about the stereotypes we live in?
Can you expand on that a bit?
Like we were talking just a bit earlier, that is it certain kind of people in Pakistan are said to be either ultra-secularist
There's
or
nothing in between.
Agnostic.
There's nothing
in between.
But I mean, this might sound a bit obscure here, but there's something that people joke about called Burger Sufism. You know, there's this great kind of interest in reading versions of Rumi and versions of mystics that are marketed for Western audiences. So if you tend not to belong too strictly either to the hardline secularists or to the hardline religious people, then you fit into this Burger Sufi category and are made fun of. And everybody expects that what you read is 40 Rules of Love by Alif Shafak, or, what's his name, the translator of Rumi, who's become so famous. Do you remember? Coleman Barks. So they think that that is where your spiritual interests lie. They don't realize that there's a whole literary heritage of things in many languages. I mean, whether it's Kabir and Mira, whether it's Hafiz and Sadi and Jami, or whether it's even somebody relatively like Khalil Gibran. So there's all that stuff. It's all part of literature. It's all part of our heritage.
And you also talk with certain degree of longing about your early days in Karachi. How your mother tried to reproduce London in Karachi.
Yeah. I think that was her longing, not mine.
Okay.
Because for me, I keep telling people, there are groups in Karachi that call themselves, I long for my old Karachi back. And I say, listen, I'm in this town almost as much as anybody who lives here, because I spend about 4 months a year there. And I say, I don't long for the old city back. There are bits of it, that I do miss. But it's a dynamic, thriving city. I mean, they've extended the seafront for miles and miles and miles. You can spend the whole day out there on the seaside. There are art galleries, there are museums, there are cinemas, there's a thriving music scene, there's a thriving literary scene, there are cafes where people read poetry, seminars in both languages, English and Urdu, and sometimes in Sindhi and Punjabi as well. So I said, what is it I would exactly miss about it? That the city was quiet? I mean, you can make any city quiet if you want to.
Not today.
Really.
You tried doing it with Indore today.
Ah, well, but Karachi still has a lot of gardens, luckily.
Yes.
Yeah. Still
but isn't Karachi a city which is forever looking for its roots?
Yeah.
You go to Karachi and you find something like Awadh apartments.
Yeah.
You find something like Lucknow house.
Yeah. Or the looking towards Sindh, for example, for heritage or for cultural backing. But I mean, it is true that you leave Karachi and you start traveling into the Sindh interior, which I did just now 2 months ago. I can tell you more about that in a minute. And you sense history in quite a different way. I mean, Karachi is a city by the sea. It's a mirage. It's a city that's built for visitors. It's a city that's built by and for outsiders. You enter the desert and you are in a different country. I mean, the Sindh interior is a different feeling altogether, absolutely.
Okay, how different? It's like you go from Delhi to the interiors of Rajasthan, something like that?
Much more marked, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, but that's a similar journey because you do traverse desert and very harsh landscapes. Barren landscapes, it's sandy, it's dusty. And then you go towards the shrines and there are all kinds of fields and so on and so forth of sugarcane, oranges, all sorts of things. And little shrines in the middle of nowhere where you can hear music at midnight.
When did you first realize that you're actually a Karachi guy?
I guess when I used to come on holiday to Indore and even Mumbai.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I would love those places, then I'd start longing
You
for
spent
my
time
city.
in Gwalior as well.
Yeah, I loved Gwalior probably more than anywhere else because there was some kind of mixture of...
heritage?
Yeah, heritage
history.
as well as a degree of modernity that I didn't find in Indore because my grandparents were conservative. They were wonderful, but they were very conservative.
Now coming to your work, how has each of these cities
shaped your mindset for those short stories?
It's very interesting because I first began to write short stories under the influence of writers from the American South. And there was this very strong sense of regionalism there.
Okay.
As if each of these writers needed a small town or community to write about. So it was natural to me to turn towards India rather than Pakistan to do that, because the smaller towns I knew were basically in India. So I think that writing about Indore and Gwalior, particularly Indore, was influential. Okay. But I think that was when I learned something quite different about myself, that I kept writing about places as an outsider, as someone who doesn't belong, as someone who's temporary, as someone who stays somewhere just for a very short time. And I think it may be that my life has been like that since I was not 13, but 11. Because I've been fairly uprooted.
But didn't Indore help you to discover the writer in you? Though you were a child at that time. With its vast spaces, quiet and everything.
You know, not the writer in me as much as the reader and the multilingual reader and the listener.
Okay.
Because you see, otherwise I would have been an Anglophone child who just knew English and just knew Urdu as a spoken language and Hindi as a spoken language. But in Indore, the living sense of Urdu and Hindi as languages of the mind, languages of the heart. I think that influenced me a lot. So in fact, the English I would then write would never quite be the English of someone who's just rooted in an Anglophone culture.
You talk of languages of the heart, and you said in one of your interviews that English is your memory language, and Urdu is your retreat. Could you elaborate on that for us?
Yeah, because I guess I was taught to think in English. I mean, from the age of about 5, I was in an English school, which is probably something I have in common with other people in this audience. So everything that I can articulate is in English.
Okay.
But Urdu then became something that was like music to me. It came to me, especially literary Urdu poetry, came to me from the outside like a gift. And very often musically.
It is more of a language of solace and maybe a degree of nostalgia?
Solace, yes, to an extent, but also of ornamentation or of escape or of fantasy and flight. And of course, harsh reality too, because a lot
Isn't
of the
that inevitable for somebody who is talking of fables and fantasies, that he should be very well versed with Urdu literature?
And Persian,
Then why did you gravitate towards English rather than Urdu?
I didn't gravitate towards English. I think English was just inevitable because I had been educated in English all the time. And because when I started to write in English, I had lived in England for 15 years, exactly half my life.
Okay.
And there wasn't any question of writing in any other language. There were there was no internet at that time. It wasn't as if I could write and send things home to wherever home was.
Okay.
And imagine that they would be published tomorrow in my native language.
But I gather you didn't really start off as a short story writer, or writer per se. You were into music in the early years?
Yeah.
Could you throw some light on that?
Oh, that was another life, actually. I just remember that one day I was standing on a stage at the age of about 29, and I had already started writing. Mostly bad poetry, but some short stories. And I was singing in public, and I said, I'm never, ever going to do this again. And I've almost kept my promise. I mean, I've sung for people once or twice.
So, do you give credit to your audiences there?
I think, writing was such a solitary activity for so long.
But then your first published work came when you were around 38, late 30s?
No. My first published story was sort of like within a year of writing fiction, 31, 32.
The first collection and all.
First collection, because I took a long time to put those stories together, Okay. But I was actually publishing left, right, and center when I wanted to.
And you were also reviewing
much of the time I didn't want to. Yeah, too much. In fact, I think one of my editors at the Times Literary Supplement told me, Aamer, if you keep on doing this, you are not going to finish your book. But the book was finished. It was in a drawer. It was being dusted. But there was a time when there was this excitement of discovering particularly work in translation.
Okay.
And also the quick money that came from reviewing.
So did the reviewer in you set the author back by many years?
No, because I was writing fiction all the time, and I'm a slow writer. In terms of my rate of production of fiction, it's not fast. If I write 2 good stories a year, I'm happy.
2 stories a year.
And some of those stories might only be 1 page long. That's happening recently. Okay. That's probably the Sufi in me.
Tell me, in last 6-7 years, there has been a concerted attempt on the part of many Pakistani writers, English writers, to write in Urdu.
No.
And people like Hanif have started doing it,
Well, Hanif Muhammad Hanif is a journalist and he's bilingual.
Yeah.
So I think he writes newspaper articles in Urdu and
Yes,
Punjabi.
now he's doing a novel too.
Is he?
Yeah.
I think somebody's translated it.
No, he's doing one
Yeah,
himself.
himself. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I saw him a few weeks ago. He didn't mention it.
Yeah.
Actually, he and the other Hanif Qureshi, were
Hanif
having
Qureshi.
a conversation next to me about 3 weeks ago.
Do we see you writing in Urdu
Mhm.
as such in the coming years? A
I
novel
think I was the
full-fledged?
first to start doing it among the English lot. And
No,
it was
a
a way
full-fledged
of,
novel, so to say,
it's-
because
no,
you've been
no.
writing
No,
Urdu.
maybe a memoir. People are sort of persuading me to write a memoir.
Too early for that?
No, I'm 63, going to be 64 in 2 months. So maybe
Okay.
not. And a memoir in Urdu would be more like a novel anyway, in some ways. Following the sequence.
Again, that will be like a window to your earliest readers in
Yeah,
Pakistan.
because a lot of people in Pakistan and Karachi have mixed heritages in the sense that they have grandparents from India, but they know nothing about it. So in a way, it would be an act of preservation.
Okay.
Or, memorializing.
But would it be a little bit awkward for them, or odd for those readers? They've read you in English for all these years, 30-odd years, and suddenly the memoirs come in Urdu.
No, because I've done 6, 7 short stories in Urdu over the
Yeah,
last
yeah,
7
that-
years. And they've been very well received, and then they've been translated back into English. Some of them were even published in India. So, no,
And talking of being published in India-
It's the English readers who find it weird and odd and, sometimes commendable and sometimes just eccentric. Why would he want to do this?
Okay. Now, talking of being published in India, your latest book hasn't come to India yet? The
No, it
Hermitage?
hasn't. That's Hermitage is just published in Pakistan a few
About
weeks
3
ago.
months ago? 2 or 3 months ago?
September it was launched,
Okay,
yeah.
4
But really November was the big kind of date, so I was back for that. And
Okay. Could you talk something about it?
yeah, Hermitage came together. It was quite a serendipitous sort of thing. A student of mine in a workshop turned out to be a very good poet with a small publishing company in Wales. And she said, would I do a little book for her, illustrated with some of my own photographs? So I had some short stories which I gave her, and she loved them. So that was just a book of about 60 pages. Then this very enterprising Pakistani publisher, Shahbano Alvi, who has her own company which does stories and books in both Urdu and English, asked me if she could do a Pakistani edition of that. And when we got to working on it, it doubled and became a full-length book.
Okay.
Some of those stories had also gone to my erstwhile editor at HarperCollins in India.
London.
Yeah,
India,
and she
okay.
just moved from one publishing house to another.
Okay.
And she was very keen on the book and actually got me working on it. And then for commercial reasons, they couldn't take it.
Oh.
So it's actually been rejected in India. And the kind of writer I am, I don't show my work to anyone. I let people come to me. I think in my life I've never sent out a book and said, would you like to have a look at it? I've always been pursued.
Which is very interesting in today's time when authors are
I don't
all the
consider
time
myself a
promoting
professional
themselves.
writer of fiction.
Okay.
It's my love, yeah, and one of my loves.
Okay.
But the whole thing of aggressive marketing and selling and just about, this Facebooking and stuff is okay. It's a bit of fun because my nephews and nieces like it. But the commercial enterprise of being a writer is just not for me.
Okay. When you're talking of something like the Hermitage today, how do you think a young guy in Delhi or in Chennai or Mumbai would relate to something like that?
They would, because the stories in it, some of them are taken from old Persian stories. 1 or 2 of them are actually very closely connected to Buddhist folklore.
Okay.
There's, what else do I have in there? There's mention of Rupmati and Baz Bahadur, and some are just contemporary modern stories of the sort I've published in India, which people like.
Okay, you talk of
And
Baz
it's-
Bahadur,
yeah.
and we are in the process of rewriting history in our country.
Uh-huh.
You would be aware of a lot of that controversy, even about Baz
Padmavat,
Bahadur,
yeah,
Padmavat
yeah,
also. Don't you think there will be a lot of scope for something like that if it comes out in Hindi in particular?
There's just a little mention of Rupmati being alone and longing, because she wrote poetry. And
I'm
my
just
mother
talking
sang that poetry.
the way to promote the book in the market beyond the Facebook.
It's actually just a few lines about them. But, those contemporary and modern stories I've written have mostly gone down well in India.
Yeah, they have.
In fact, sometimes when people read something about me, I learn about myself because they say that Aamer Hussein often writes about the kind of beleaguered little Muslim in Europe or something like that. I said, do I? And then I looked at my work, and basically much of what I write is about
India.
not just about India. It's about people who are Moorless in Europe, who've lost their roots and come to Europe, because that has been, for me, the reality of the last 20 years. You see people coming from Iraq, you see people coming from Turkey, from Iran.
Yeah, there's a certain sense of rootlessness in Europe.
Yeah, because the people I've been surrounded by have been rootless. I mean, it started off with Armenians and Poles when I was at school, and compared to them, I was very rooted, because my parents were back and forth from Pakistan and India all the time. But since then, I mean, the number of people who are around me, who are either voluntary exiles, but more often than not voluntary exiles, or exiles of conscience, is great. So it's whether it's in France, whether it's in Italy or Germany or England.
How do you address the concept of an exile in your work?
Oh, that's interesting, because on the one hand you can think that we're probably all exiles from something or another. And of course you go right back to Persian poetry over there where they say that
We are all immigrants.
it's the root that we pull from the reed bed. But on the other hand, the real exile is something that I'm not. I mean, I can say that I was maybe in the Ziya years, I refused to go back to Pakistan during that heavy military regime.
I guess most guys did.
Yeah, but I now regret it. I wish I had gone and seen it for myself.
And even Fahmida Riaz came down to India at the time.
My
In
dear
fact,
friend, yeah.
Yeah, Fahmida had quite a few good things to say about your Urdu writing.
Yeah, and about my English.
Yeah, needless to say.
Fahmida Riaz was a wonderful poet. She was about a decade my senior, and she just died a couple of months ago. So in fact, my last 2 visits to Pakistan in November and December were largely taken up with memorials for her and remembering her life and her work and so on and so forth. And Fahmida translated some of my stories into Urdu as well many years ago. But, in her own right, she was a very, very, very good poet and good fiction writer as well. And a left-wing thinker, which is not exactly common among women intellectuals in Pakistan who write in Urdu. I mean, it's there, but it's a kind of suppressed wave. She was very open with her politics.
It's basically not common in the Pakistan society as such.
Well, it is in a way, but more among journalists. I mean, the thing with Fahmida is that she made her practice, her life, and her activism all one thing. So her poetry was political, it was feminist, it was anti-establishment, and it was poetry first and foremost. She never lost the poetic line. That was something that she stuck to.
That was a very difficult balance to strike.
Yeah, very difficult, and especially in Urdu, which is a language which is prone to lyricism and excess.
But Urdu is also largely an anti-establishment language.
It has been. I mean, if you think of Akbar Allahabadi or Nazir Akbar Abadi, and even Ghalib sometimes, but it can be just as much an establishment language, I think.
Tell me about Urdu in Pakistan, because here in India, Urdu is associated with a certain community. Till the late 70s, Urdu did not have a religion. Over the last 30 years, Urdu has certainly has developed a religion. How is it in Pakistan? Is it the national language of a country where it is not the state language of any state?
I think that Urdu is indispensable to every element of Pakistani life. First of all, let's look at it purely socially. Because if you come from one province, you can't even speak to another in another language. And as for English, forget it. It's a language of a minority. It's spoken in small university departments. It's not a lingua franca. Urdu is the lingua franca of Pakistan. We need it. We need to have it. We need to read it, to write it, because everybody actually it becomes mobile and upwardly mobile through Urdu. And it's through Urdu that you get access to English eventually.
Okay, many of the Pakistani authors I've spoken to, they say there's very limited readership for English works, even
for
the best
English works. Yeah. I mean, you can sell, if you publish an English book, it's likely to be 300 to 500 copies for your first edition. But it can be up to 1,100. If it's Urdu, it's probably likely to be 3,000.
Okay.
1,100 upwards, yeah. So the readership for Urdu is vast, but it is for popular writers, which I think might be the case anyway. I mean, like you get people reading Chetan Bhagat here in English. You get people reading Aamer Ahmed there in Urdu. You have that. But people do read literary fiction. There are literary digests. If you go to a festival and an Urdu writer of literary prose or poetry has a session, it'll be packed, jam-packed, much more so than an English one.
Than an English author.
Yeah. Mohsen Hamid or Mohammad Hanif will fill a hall.
Yeah, they will.
I'll get 150, 200 people in the room.
I was speaking to people like Aamer Hussein and Moinuddin Daniel. They said, we just have our
Daniel
own...
Moinuddin is not a Pakistani writer, he's American.
They said basically we just have our own circle of followers.
Daniel is not writing for a Pakistani audience. He's writing about Pakistani village life of 50 years ago for an American New Yorker audience. Whereas people like Kamila and Mohsin and Hanif live, I mean, those two live in Pakistan. Kamila is back and forth. They're very conscious of a Pakistani audience.
Kamila in particular is very particular of our Karachi roots.
Yeah.
Do you share that sentiment with her?
Yes and no, because I do have the sense of roots, but I think that my audience has to be much more open-minded than just expecting me to write about where I was born.
No, like she says, I go abroad and all that, I write over there, but when I want fuel for my next work, inspiration for my next work, I have to come back to Karachi and spend some time.
But she's not doing that anymore. I think Home Fire and the last one were very much more rooted in English realities. So
yeah, no, she said ultimately the inspiration has to come from some element of Karachi society.
I think that God in Every Stone was very much more about the Northwest frontier. Yes, I think that has probably gone to an extent in her work. I think writers grow up. And she started very young, and she also was always in the public eye as a writer.
Always.
So she always had to editorialize and speak about what she was doing.
Tell me today, what is your concept of home?
Oh, there's the home where I was born, which is Karachi. And that'll always be, I think, my home
London?
in a way. Yeah, Maida Vale in London, Little Venice in London is very much home for me. That's literally, the place where I feel the ground under my feet.
Okay.
But I mean, I might just move out 3 miles. I'm also agoraphobic quite severely. So if I move too far away from where I live, I feel I'm in a strange place.
But you won't call Indore your home?
Not at all anymore, no.
Not anymore?
It's just, no, it was my grandmother's house and that was it, yeah.
And your Mamu's house in Uti?
He didn't have his own house. He lived in
Anymore.
a school. Where did he live? Did he live in did he have a room upstairs or something? Or was it? Saddam. But in the same building as all of you were, or upstairs in that helipad? He was in that room. Yeah, now I remember where it was. I do.
Mukundan, you were schoolmates?
Briefly, yeah.
Briefly. Okay, there has been a lot of basically commentary on your use of fable in your shorter stories. Could you enlighten our audiences who haven't read too much of fables here?
It's funny because one of the writers I liked best when I was developing, or two of the writers I might mention, one was Isaac Dinnis and Karen Blixen, who's known as the Out of Africa writer, but she wrote modern stories that had this sense of European legend in them, but also were very influenced by the 1001 Nights.
Okay.
I always liked her. By nature, my writing was realist. It just fell into kind of very plodding everyday realism. It was something I wanted to do. Then I loved the Japanese Tanizaki, Junichiro Tanizaki, who again looked at Japanese folklore and legend a lot. As I went along, I think I just collected a lot of stories from everywhere. And the most recent work has just been sheerly taking a few stories from Rumi or Attar, not The Conference of the Birds, some other works of his, and just looking at the Persian and doing an English prose version of it, which hardly changes it from the Persian at all. It's just something I feel like doing. It's an exercise and, maybe in meditation of a sort,
But how do you address that concept of nativity, cultural relativity?
Expand.
Because
we're talking about appropriation. How do you appropriate? But it's mine, so how would I be appropriating it? My grandmother tongue is Persian. So I'm only putting my own grandmother tongue into English for readers who can't. I mean, so many people in Pakistan can't read Persian.
Okay.
So, but no, I have no problems like that. And the other problem I really don't have is when people say, oh, Indian writers write about saris and bindis and mangoes.
That's a stereotype.
The whole problem is that if an English writer writes about crumpets or muffins or strawberries, are we going to tell them that they're being nativist? No. We talk about how very English this is. So, I mean, if you're eating a flipping mango and it comes into your story, what's the harm? It's okay, it's fine. I have no problems with it.
What I was saying was, when you're appropriating, as you said, a Persian fable for English.
But I'm not. I'm becoming that fable. That's the whole thing that they tell you to do. Become the thing.
Okay. I guess that's all we'll have time for today. But before we call it off, I guess we'll have time, about 5 minutes, for a few questions from the audiences about the long story, the short story writer, Aamer Hussein. And it to do with his works, or maybe even his upcoming book, The Hermitage.
Well, I'm sorry, I heard very little of your conversation, but since I've not read any of your books, to be very frank with you, what exactly, can you just expand or just mention the themes you write on, both the long and the short stories?
My long works were Another Gulmohar Tree, both published in India.
The Gulmohar Tree.
Another Gulmohar Tree was about an English woman who marries a Pakistani and goes to live in Karachi in the 50s and 60s. And in many ways, as I wrote it, I realized it was a work of, again, memorializing, because a lot of English women who came and lived in Karachi, or Western women, actually adjusted brilliantly well. And this was about the possibilities that a woman could have living away from Europe, where her life might have been more limited. And the husband, who's a writer, actually is stifled by Ayub Khan's military regime, which was subtly oppressive. And it's also about a writer who's getting frustrated with the life that he leads. The Cloud Messenger was the second novel that came here. That was really going to be about how somebody's sentimental education in the language of poetry or the language of high literature doesn't teach him to cope with a life. With a life, you know, poetry is not really the greatest teacher about how to resolve your psychological dilemmas. But then, like all novels, it became into a novel about all kinds of things. Living far from your roots, living a life of contemplation in some ways. But I also wanted to write about someone who was not a writer like myself. Someone who yearned for literary fulfillment, but was not able to create anything. Whereas for me, creating fiction was never a problem. It started young.
I remember one of the characters in Gulmohar Tree.
Sorry, there was another
He
question.
says,
No, just this, you were talking about poetry, which is more true to life, poetry, or because you said he couldn't connect or he was not too happy about what came through poetry. So is that because it's not true to life, and is it too imaginary?
No, I think that the tradition of Urdu and Persian poetry is about self-abnegation. You know, about losing yourself. Of course, it's meant to refer to a higher reality, but really it's about how you're destroyed by love and how you willfully destroy yourself. And I don't think that really is a very good lesson for living.
Makes it more miserable.
Yeah. And you were saying? A character in Gulmohar.
so I said one of the characters in the Gulmohar, Usman, he says, you don't choose the language you write in. The language chooses.
Yeah.
So that also says about the subject as such.
Yes.
What she was talking about,
yes,
self-abnegation and other
absolutely.
things.
Yeah. I think that's true.
Hello, I'm Mrs. Vidya Shankar, and I'm a struggling writer myself. I had my first book of poetry published last year. I also write short stories. And in my attempt to promote my book over this last year, I came upon a very nasty truth that there is no literature anymore. There are only bestsellers. What do you have to say about that?
Oh, well, that's true, but if people are so happy with bestsellers...
But you're asking this to a guy who says he doesn't market his books.
I heard that, which is why I'm asking him.
Yeah. I think, you know, there's a phrase in Urdu, hua kare. It just means, you know, let it happen if it happens. What can we say? I mean, you know, people write those books, they please people, because I know people, we were talking about Pakistan or in England, who will give you Chetan Bhagat or Umair Ahmed as their canonical writer. So obviously there's something we're missing out on if we don't really appreciate these people. But you know, you write for the few people who read you.
Yes, I write because I have to write.
If 10 people like what you write, you've done what you need to do.
Yes.
But get it out there, because you know what happens is if you have it in a book, that book lasts. It turns up somewhere on some library shelf. 100 years later, someone picks it up and finds some trace in it that they will, you know,
yes,
respond
exactly,
to. And, yeah.
exactly, which is why I did this.
See, a
Thank
book
you so
never
much.
dies.
Yes.
Sir, do you think the writing short story is easy than a novel?
Yes, for me it is, but for many people it isn't. For me, it's definitely easier than writing a novel, because when I wrote a novel, I had to struggle with things like temporality, time, sequences, etc. Whereas a story comes to you, like a gift from somewhere. I mean, even if you have to struggle with it.
Nowadays, the people are not ready to read the novels. It took a long time, and
I don't know. I think that you need to be very lazy to read a novel. Because novels take forever, and readers of novels usually want long things because they don't want to concentrate and focus for 5 minutes. A short story or a poem can demand so much of you. I mean, there's so many serious readers of short stories who'll tell you that they can't get anything from it until they've read it 3 times. But they get the shock and the wonder.
But the thing is that I am a budding writer, not a full writer, and I'm thinking the climax is my problem. Even writing short story, the climax is the problem. Ending is the huge.
That's true, because a short story needs a kick, whereas the novel doesn't. But very often, if you just have a very, very beautiful, fine last line in a short story, it works. And I think that's where, for the short story writer, reading poetry is even more important than reading short fiction.
Does a novel require you to basically say goodbye to the world for a long period of time?
Yeah,
be in your own time and space?
Yeah, well, Nadim Aslam spent that 11 years writing a novel about really depressing people. And I think, living in an attic for 11 years and doing that would just kill me. I spent a year on the Cloud Messenger, and that was enough.
You use the word realism, plotting realism, actually, in a kind of self-deprecating
It's very affectionately said.
Yeah, I know. But I just wondered in this context, do you think the world of literary fiction over the last few decades has got too caught up with experiments in form? Is it being pushed, rather like the world of contemporary art, to constantly play around with conventional forms of storytelling, linearity, and so on? And do you think the realist writers, say a Carver, for instance, do they get a short shrift because of the dictates and the push of the prevailing literary fashion?
Yeah, Mukund, in short fiction, yes. I think that the tendency in short fiction, because it doesn't sell very well, is to turn it into some kind of game, to make it ludic. And if it isn't playful with language, playful with form, or like Lydia Davis approaching grammatology or philosophy or aphoristic expression, the short story writer is very often given short shrift, but not in things like literary prizes, small journals, and so on. There you find the realistic short story is thriving. And I, as you know, spent 3 years judging short story prizes. I find that people are still writing what we might call conventional short fiction. And very well, very, very well.
Yeah, there's a lot of convention when it comes to shorter stories, but also when it comes to novels, as Mukund said, there's a lot of experimentation. We also saw the latest work of Arundhati Roy. So it was a different kind of attempt.
Yeah, well, I think the novel does tend to become rather more linear than it was, let's say, 20 years ago. I think modernism breathed its last in about 2000 with Ian McEwan's Atonement in the English language. And after that, work in English has been fairly conventionally, rigidly structured. It's the subject matter that might be futuristic or speculative.
Tell me, how is the market for short fiction in Pakistan?
Good.
Because it isn't so in India.
Insofar as anything is good, no one in Pakistan is going to tell you, I didn't want to buy such a book because it was of short stories. It'll be just as, popular, successful as a novel, or nearly so. We just happen to have more novelists in English.
Okay.
I think only Daniel Moinuddin, if you consider him a Pakistani writer, and I are working, regularly in the short story form.
Sir, I am Mohammed, a banker and a teacher. Welcome to Chennai. What is the message you want to give for a young, budding Muslim writer in India in global perspective?
That is so hard. Be yourself. Be all yourselves. You probably have many of them. Your linguistic identity, your cultural identity, your religious identity, and your identity as a writer above all, I think.
Basically, it's just a question of retaining your identity your linguistic, your regional, your religious identity, and you'll be better off for it.
Yes. I mean, we are our many selves, I think. And they will come into our writing, even through the back door. So.
But won't there be a danger of anybody, as he said, a Muslim writer from India, okay, becoming a hyphenated writer? Like we have this concept of Indo-American writers, Anglo-Pak writers.
You know, I'm afraid it's a burden we have to shoulder. If I started telling you all the many identities I've had, I mean, a friend of mine is not in the room at the moment, though she's here, who lives in Delhi. And an article by me came out in, what was that magazine, the short-lived one that everyone, Telka. Yeah. They asked me to comment on the bombs in London in 2005. And they said, British Muslim writer Aamer Hussein comments on politics in London. And she said, when did you become this Muslim writer? And I said, Geeta, at the moment, it's fine. That's what they need in Delhi. I can play that role. I don't mind.
But how do you transcend that expression, Muslim writer? A writer is a writer.
A writer is a writer, but then we're all the things we are, all the identities we are, I think. So, but it's okay, I don't mind. I mean, what I hate is, I think the two things I hate. One is diasporic writer, because I don't belong to a diaspora. My parents didn't, exile themselves from their countries of origin.
That's an expression so many journalists would have used for you.
And the other one is, I think, there was something to do with British that I used to mind, but I think at 63 I've just stopped minding anything really, except this diaspora thing. At home in Pakistan, I mean, I go there and they say, sir, as a subject of the diaspora, are you second generation or are you first generation? And how deeply do you feel the wound of exile? And I said, well, I'm sitting right here, right in the middle of all of you, so why would I be feeling a wound of exile? I mean, I'm here for you. You're my captive audience and I'm your captive reader. So that kind of thing annoys me. But no, the social identities are fine.
Okay.
Because I think the writer has to be, today, probably a journalist to some extent, a spokesperson to some extent. So we have all these different things.
Yeah, growing up, I read journalists are failed writers.
No, I think the journalists have a duty that they take on and embrace, which is probably above these days that of the fiction writer, because we're lazy. I mean, we basically write about what we want to. You're the ones who have to deal with the real stuff and tell the world about it, and what we very often kind of have to take from you.
There's one question.
Could you explain why Anton Chekhov and O. Henry, they never wrote novels?
Because a short story is such a satisfying form. I think that if you can say what you want to in 5 pages, why would you want to say it in take longer to say? Yeah, but Dostoevsky liked to, I think, dwell on things. So it's possibly the desire to be succinct and brief, and to say everything and to suggest everything, rather than to go into detail. Or a Tolstoy or a Dostoevsky will want to go into very much historical and social detail, or psychological or philosophical detail. I think Tolstoy could do both. Recently, my publisher in Pakistan told me that Dostoevsky was also a very good short story writer, which I had never known. Mostly a novellist, yeah. Yeah, I've managed to get some stories now, which I'm going to read. Because I always thought that Dostoevsky wrote doorstoppers only. But the two you mentioned, Chekhov also writes longish short stories, usually. And O. Henry's are very short, but they both are able to tell the whole story in a few pages.
Sir, over here.
And she's saying something? Right in front.
I didn't.
I did.
I have written 10 books and I've been a journalist, even now I'm that. And my books are doing well.
I don't think they're failed writers at all. I think there are things that actually one needs to look to the journalist to do, and I often say this in literary things when I talk to my audiences in Pakistan, and they say, why don't you, living abroad, give this picture or that vision of our country to foreigners? And I say, no, that's what journalists do, because they mark the reality on the ground. They tell us what's happening. I would look to their books and not to novels for a lot of information. Yeah, it's something that I,
Yeah, there was a question.
Sir, yeah, here. Sir, as a short fiction writer, sir, to your left.
Where are you?
I'm standing to your left, raising my hand.
Oh, right, yeah.
So as a short fiction writer, yourself and others in the room, is it normal to research on the topic or whatever you're writing, or is it an impulse?
Both. That's a very good question, both, because very often I read a lot of non-fiction or history and memoirs. Yeah, and it just comes to me, so it is, in a way, then the story is research-based.
Okay, yeah, because I wouldn't have seen any conflict.
No.
So if I want to write something, I have to research. Is it okay or?
Of course.
Yeah?
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to write a historical novel or something, what I do find very often is that write what your instinct is telling you and then do the research later. Okay. And you'll find how uncannily accurate your findings have been. You know, what you've imagined turns out to be true because that imagination is based on some truth that you've picked up somewhere at an unconscious level. Sure. Yes?
Like in Urdu, in Malayalam also, and that's my language, if you look at modern Malayalam, the novel came first. But the form that became really successful was the short story.
Identical in Urdu.
Yes. Yeah. And I was thinking if it had something to do with, the way Urdu as a language and Malayalam as a very small language, compared to, placed geographically also, very minor in some ways.
But huge in terms of what is produced in fiction.
Yes, yes. Yeah. No, but I'm thinking about the history of these modern literature in these languages. If it has something to do with the way these languages are positioned vis-a-vis nationalism, in some ways the novel has a kind of a very the way modern novel has developed in the South Asian languages has had to do a lot with nationalism.
True.
I was wondering if the short story as a form then becomes even more relevant now, if you think about the way nationalisms have gone.
Yes, but also the opposite. I think that the short story in both these languages you've talked about, because I can only read Malayalam in translation into either English or Hindi or Urdu, is that the short story allows the writer to move away from those huge concerns and also be extremely experimental with the use of the line on the page, the use of perspective, and the use of obliquity, of talking about important things, momentous things, in a literary fashion. I mean, I was reading some of Lalitambika Antarjanam's stories in translation not long ago, and you see that she's always both interweaving the political or the feminist with the aesthetic and the personal. But her novel is very beautiful. Agni Sakshi, yeah, it's very beautiful. And again, more metaphysical than political, I think, though it has Gandhi and everything in it. It's got history, it's got absolutely everything. And it's written like a short fiction writer's novel.
It's actually the answer to history.
Yeah, yeah. That is, you see, that's, for this question about journalism, very often fiction can give that subjective answer to history, that journalism, which is too concerned with the, with the moment and with the immediate, may not give until later.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid we have time only for this much.
Yeah. Yeah. That's right. But also from a very subjective point of view, and also based very strongly in a historical moment about untouchability and Gandhi and so on. So it's so organically woven together.
Thank you, everybody. That, in brief, is the long 3-decade-old career, literary career of Aamer Hussein. Thanks a lot, Aamer, for coming over. He came in only this morning at 4 o'clock and was here at the venue by 9.
Yeah, I reached the hotel at 4, so...
Thank you very much.